We're doing something a little bit different this month. We're not talking about a silent film or a Spielberg film. We're talking about musical, not musicals per se, but musical concert films and a film inspired by a band. We're talking, of course, about True Stories and David Byrne's American Utopia. All of this was brought on by some earlier discussions involving Mr. Byrne and the Talking Heads. And I just realized that the 35th anniversary of True Stories is coming up in just about a month, October 10th, 1986.
Been a while.
Yeah.
So one reason I was interested to talk about this with you, because when you, I guess after our previous conversation, you played the Talking Heads 1979 album, Fear of Music.
Yes.
Because we had been discussing Spielberg's AI, rather, and there was an image from AI that reminded me of some of the cover art on that Talking Heads LP.
That's right.
You search that out, and then you listen to the album itself, and we're understandably intrigued by it, impressed by it, dare I say?
Yes.
I think over time it's become my favorite Talking Heads album, or at least the album that I esteem the highest. And so after your enthusiasm for it, it got me to thinking about David Byrne in film terms, and particularly about True Stories, which I had not seen since it came out in 1986. And so I was interested, I was intrigued to go there again and revisit it and see what it had to offer, see how it affected me today, how it looked today. I think I might have said to you before, my thought is, one of my theories about film is that, about film criticism and responding to art, is that films don't change, we change. And so I was curious to see whether my attitude towards True Stories had changed in light of AI, in light of David Byrne, in light of American Utopia. And so I was anxious to revisit it and to talk about that, all of that with you.
Yeah, I'm curious to find out where this conversation goes. I think I want to start sort of with that 79 album. I had not heard it before. My knowledge of the Talking Heads and of David Byrne was pretty much limited to the greatest hits. You know, it was in the early and mid 80s that they kind of blew up, and their music was all over movies, and they were a huge success. But that music was very different from where they started out with, as evidenced by my ears just kind of exploding when I listened to that album. Like, what? I don't recognize this. I recognize the voices and the sounds, but the music is very experimental. It's very cool. I only knew one song from that record, and I think that was E Zimbra. And then after having watched American Utopia, literally for the first time minutes before we jumped on here, I finished it. That's quite a trajectory the music has taken, and the kind of the living performance art of David Byrne has taken over the decades. So I do want to get into that with you. True Stories, I watched that a few years ago for the first time, and then watching it again over the last couple of days, I experienced it differently, because I don't know if I like it as much as the first time I saw it. And I feel like a lot of it has to do with sort of political leanings, my own political evolution in the last couple of years. I don't think it's a very nice movie, if that makes any sense.
That's an interesting word. I believe Susan Sontag said, "Never use the word nice or interesting," and we both broke her rules.
Yes,
but I would say the movie David Byrne in his film directorial debut. I think he meant to be nice, but it doesn't come off nice.
Right.
It's the film, we should say, is some kind of a musical that's set in a place called Virgil, Texas, which does not exist. So David Byrne plays a narrator figure who goes to Virgil, Texas. He drives there in a red convertible automobile, and he observes all the local Texas settings and people and customs and habits, and he looks at them like, David Byrne's approach, I think, to America is seems to be benign, but but his curiosity it's a strange curiosity, because the way he observes American people is like one looks at bugs through a magnifying glass, and that's what I think he starts out benign, but it comes off as the opposite, because I think it seems as if he doesn't really respect the people that or the types, the Texas American types that he's observing. He's observing them as types rather as people, it seems. And even when the film turns into a kind of musical, and the characters in Virgil, Texas, sing talking head songs, uh, it doesn't make them any less weird. And that somehow strikes me, maybe it struck you this same way, as almost anti-American, as if these people are bizarre. And why should they be bizarre if they're average? If they're just like everybody else, why should they appear strange to us? And I think that's my problem with the film. And I think it's part of David Byrne's problem as an American artist. He looks at American people, American habit and behavior, from a weird kind of distance. And I think it's a distance that comes off as, at least in 1986, because I never liked it, by the way. I never liked it the first time I saw it, but I was, open-minded, and I'm willing to revisit it again. And my dislike did not change. So what seemed condescending in 1986 seems condescending to me today. And especially after watching American Utopia, probably it seems now to me probably worse than condescending.
First of all, I want to say I generally agree with that idea of not using nice or interesting, but in the context I was using nice in is the meaning, or I guess the meaning of it, not necessarily, oh, that was a nice movie or that was a nice moment, but I mean nice in terms of polite, kind. It just doesn't seem like a very kind movie. That's a better term of expression for exactly the reason you're saying. Now, I want to emphasize that, and I don't know how widely this was known back in 1986, but from what I understand, David Byrne is autistic. So that makes his detachment from people and his kind of like observational, kind of spacey mindset understandable. But my concern is the people who are latching onto the material, aren't necessarily autistic. It almost gives them license to look at, Americans or people in the South, people in Texas, as these kind of alien life forms, because like, well, here's a guy who's observing them as a scientist, as bugs under a magnifying glass. I would go so far as to say bugs under a magnifying glass out in the sun, because they're sort of frying under that unkind, unflattering gaze. But yeah, it's a movie that seems kind of sweet. It's a PG film with a bunch of wacky assorted characters, but you do kind of wonder what Byrne and the people behind the film actually think of their subjects. I know it was co-written. Stephen Tobolowsky was one of the co-writers. It's hard to pinpoint. It's hard to accuse the movie of being against the people that it's representing, because I don't have any proof, but I also can't watch it without thinking they might be kind of making fun of the folks in Virgil. I don't think that's fair.
What kind of conversation are we going to have if we agree on everything? But we agree. But let me dare to address the autism issue.
Okay.
I certainly, in all the years since I discovered Talking Heads back in 1977, and discovered David Byrne's art and followed it, I never knew until recently that he was, quote, autistic. So for me, it's meaningless. And it makes me suspect that it's a it might be a contemporary fad, which is not to downgrade or disrespect those who are autistic, or even his own personal issues. But it was never an issue, frankly. Watching, enjoying David Byrne's art, trying to understand it. So autism, where is he on the spectrum, and what has that got to do with the art that he's produced? He's always seemed to me a very perceptive and very creative person. And also, I have to say, through his association with Jonathan Demme on the film Stop Making Sense, I respect Jonathan Demme as a great humanist artist. And I think Byrne's collaboration with Jonathan Demme suggests to me that he could be a humanist as well. So when he veers from Demme's humanism, evident in Stop Making Sense, and maybe one of the songs from Something Wild, when he veers from that into his own movie, True Stories, I cannot give him the excuse of autism. I think I think he I think he's misapplying the lessons he should have learned from Jonathan Demme. I think his quote unquote humanism in True Stories goes awry. Something's wrong with it. I would also suggest that what's wrong has a little bit to do with his collaborators on True Stories. The screenwriter Stephen Tobolowsky, but also there's another co-screenwriter, Beth Hindley. Mm-hmm. And Beth Hindley is a playwright of the Neo-South. She's best known for the play and film Crimes of the Heart, which I think came out in 1986 as well. Mm. Did you ever see that film, Ian?
No, I didn't. I know the name of it, but I haven't seen it.
Right. It stars Diane Keaton, Sissy Spacek, and Jessica Lange as three sisters, three odd sisters, Southern sisters, and their relationships with men and with each other. And Beth Hindley also wrote a film called Miss Firecracker. It starred Holly Hunt. Beth Hindley specializes in a kind of neo-Southern Gothic. She's a playwright from the 1980s primarily, and she's interested in, and she's a Southerner herself, and she sees Southerners as weird. But it's a different kind of weird. It's a different kind of bizarre from Southerners like Carson McCullers and Flannery O'Connor and Tennessee Williams. Beth Hindley is something of a satirist, and what she often presents as laughable is sometimes, in fact, clinical and I think cruel. And I think it takes a special kind of actor or actors to get past it. I would say in the case of Crimes of the Heart and Miss Firecracker, that Alfred Woodard and Diane Keaton and Sissy Spacek and Jessica Lange, they get past the cruelty and they make those characters very, very human. That doesn't happen in True Stories. Probably the most sympathetic character I felt as I watched it would be the John Goodman character, who plays an oversized an oversized man, a rotund man who works in a computer factory. And he's looking for love, but he's having trouble finding it. I think John Goodman is a good actor, and he comes closest to making David Byrne / Beth Hindley's Southern weirdo seem human and sympathetic. But that doesn't happen for the rest of the characters. The rest of the characters are just eccentric and bizarre. And I think Byrne has to take the blame for that.
It's weird that it's fitting, I guess, that you bring up Lewis Fine, that the Goodman character. Towards the end of the film, let's just set this. The Virgil, Texas is getting ready to have their sesquicentennial celebration, a celebration of specialness, as David Byrne puts it, and they're going to put on a big show. And at the end of the week, everyone's kind of getting ready to perform these, talent musical numbers, from marching around to Shriners in, small red cars, to a weird act where they've got a yodeler and two dueling auctioneers, which is kind of, fun to watch. But then John Goodman comes out and he does a solo song. Now, before that, like a couple of days before, maybe it was the day before, he was with a woman that he was interested in going out with, because that's, as you mentioned, his search for love is sort of the undercurrent of this movie. He says, I've been working on this song for the talent show. Would you like to hear it? And so he sings it, and it's this sad, kind of pathetic song. And even the lady that he's singing it to says, why would you sing that to anybody? But when he goes out on stage, he has fine-tuned it into this essentially Talking Heads weird rock number that's a very upbeat song. But if you listen to the lyrics are kind of sad and condescending. Who's going to answer your phones? Watch me as I grow big as the house. Essentially it's an ode to, kind of slovenliness and mediocrity that, the crowd kind of eats up, which, if you step back and look at it from filmmakers who may not have the best interest of the people that they are making this about at heart, you could say, yeah, we're going to make fun of you and you're going to love it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So yeah, that's all true about the Fine character. And some of it, as I watched, I thought a little bit of the problem has to do with Byrne's lack of skills as a filmmaker. A lot of it, I think, is plainly amateurish, but it's a kind of amateurish that passes for smart in the art world. Byrne doesn't have to have any refined storytelling, dramaturgical finesse or roundedness in terms of narrative, and he doesn't have to be particularly good with actors. It seems sometimes in watching movies, sometimes actors are just on their own. If they're good, they can push through. Sometimes, in the case of a great filmmaker like Steven Spielberg, and I'll say Brian De Palma, just for the surprise of it, there are filmmakers who know how to work with actors very well and get best performances from actors. David Byrne is not at all at that level. So a lot of times the actors in true stories, they're just doing routines, and they don't work. John Goodman, I think, works some of the time, but the problem is with the way his character has been conceived and the way David Byrne films him. Also, the way David Byrne films and edits the audience reactions to Fine's singing. It strikes me as very amateurish. Although, if you were to see that exact same film clip in a museum installation, you would say it's ironic. And that kind of thing, I think that doesn't always work. Thank God, almost never works in popular cinema, because Hollywood tradition and even the art film tradition teaches us better. Teaches us to often expect a recognizable and believable, credible response from one character to another. And Byrne, as a filmmaker, doesn't know how to do that in true stories. So even the audience reaction to Fine comes off as odd. Everything is odd. And it's like 90 minutes of oddness, which then makes me want to address it. You point out the detail of the sesquicentennial parade in Virgil, Texas, which is called, as you said, as you noted, a celebration of specialness. This is a problem too, because the word special is double-edged. We go back to the idea of David Byrne being autistic. When we were in school, in elementary school, autistic kids were often called special.
Special education, that's right, yeah.
It became a term of condescension. Right? And so when the celebration of specialness banner is hung across the main street of Virgil, Texas, I thought, uh-oh, we're condescending to others again.
Yeah, that's a great point. This movie reminded me of two other films which I liked a lot better, and I think actually three other films I think presented this idea of satirizing small town America much more effectively because it seemed like they had something to say beyond "Aren't they all dumb?" One was, and not so much small town America, but this is more of an aesthetic thing. Pee-wee's Big Adventure. There's definitely some weird, darkness with neon lighting and these weird atmospherics going on that reminded me of Tim Burton. The next film would be another sesquicentennial film, Waiting for Guffman, which came out, I think, 10 years after this. And it was about a small town putting on a musical number. And then the last one, I just had it and it left me. Oh, Edward Scissorhands. Not so much that this film reminded me of it. It just reminded me of a filmmaker who was trying to satirize, suburbia, small town living, but I think did it in a way that was much more over the top and not so much a way that, like Tim Burton, when he made fun of the people that Edward Scissorhands had to interact with, he made everything candy colored and big and giant poofy hair and really went to the extremes to make a cartoon. In this film, Byrne is just a hair, like 1 degree to the left of reality, which could imply that he thinks that these people are actually living this way and are actually behaving this way. So it didn't bother me as much when Tim Burton did it, but it struck me the wrong way with Byrne.
Well, once again, I like those connections. Once again, though, we're dealing with the example of an accomplished filmmaker in the case of Tim Burton. And Tim Burton is gifted. He's gifted at comedy. He's gifted at surrealism, in which David Byrne in True Stories is not. And as I was watching it, True Stories again, I did think of it with Scissorhands, and the way Tim Burton depicts that suburban community. It's kind of similar to that, that left off kilter point of view you mentioned about True Stories. I'll say, with the exception of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, those are my least favorite Tim Burton films. Oops, wait, let me fix that because he's gotten worse.
I was going to say, have you seen Dumbo?
Dumbo, Alice in Wonderland. Those are among my least favorite, but they're among his better films, though, and that's because I think what makes a good Tim Burton film, despite his affection for horror movies and comic books and surrealism, is I think his geniality. And what makes him a good filmmaker, an interesting filmmaker in the past, is that he's able to convey that and express it. David Byrne doesn't know how. He's a terrific musician, but he's not a terrific filmmaker. He doesn't know how to really get his feelings across. Instead, the attitude comes across, or pretense comes across, but not feeling. And I felt this as I watched True Stories, and especially the John Goodman closing song, because it made me think of my favorite Tim Burton film, as a matter of fact. My favorite Tim Burton film being Mars Attacks. And it made me think of how in Mars Attacks, Tim Burton uses, oh my God, what's the name? The country western yodeler, Whit. His name is Whit. Oh man.
I'm blanking. I'm blanking.
It's a country western yodeler, famous country western yodeler. The name just skipped my mind. But it is the yodeling that finally vanquishes the Martian invaders, because they can't stand the high pitched yodeling. But to all the Earthling American characters, it's wonderful and beautiful. It's a wonderful and beautiful example of their culture, and it's not condescended to. It is salvific, in fact. And so that's part of the geniality that is part of that is that defines Tim Burton's gifts. David Byrne doesn't have gifts. David Byrne is instead, he's kind of cerebral, as the name Talking Heads helps to indicate. And he's thinking all the time, and as Bob Dylan said, thinking can fuck you up. Um, you know.
Real quick, I did a quick Google search. Slim Whitman, I think.
Whitman.
Yes.
Yes. Slim Whitman, the great Slim Whitman. Absolutely. Thank you, the great Slim Whitman. That's it.
And this kind of brings us, we can probably come back to true stories, but I do want to get to American Utopia, because something that you just said reminded me of that and the problem that I had with that movie, which is a straight up concert film. It's basically the Broadway show, set to film with a couple of enhancements, I guess. But, David Byrne is cerebral. He's a poet, he's a songwriter, he cares about things, but he seems to care about things in one direction. And this is something that, as my own life, I've evolved from, a very kind of liberal person to, coming into my own in some, sort of conservative and possibly even libertarian leanings, but with still a progressive heart. There's that, I think that Dave Rubin saying that, I didn't leave the left left me. And I definitely feel that. But, he talks a lot about empathy and sympathy, in the movie, and he has a very diverse cast of musicians playing along with him, but it just feels very performative and obvious and just in one direction. It doesn't feel like this was a show made that you couldn't tour Virgil, Texas with American Utopia. It's very much built for one specific audience. And I felt the divide while I was watching this, like the full hour and 45 minutes. Even when he was singing his old kind of Talking Head standards, it felt like, that was the catnip to keep everybody interested, as he was, they were doing other things that were not, from the hits catalog.
Sure, I get you. I felt the same way. American Utopia was a huge disappointment to me. I had not seen the stage show, so I was curious to see the movie. I thought, well, here's a chance to finally see what that show was like. But I thought it was a disaster, and it was it was everything I feared, and my fear began with realizing that David Byrne hired Spike Lee to direct the film version of the American Utopia stage. Spike Lee is a more experienced filmmaker, of course, than David Byrne. He's an experienced filmmaker. Doesn't make him a good one. Spike Lee has talent. Doesn't make him a good filmmaker. I think he's a talented guy. I think he's best suited for TV commercials. But he has talent with the medium, but his films are mostly offensive and disturbing in an unhelpful way. And I thought for David Byrne to hook up with Spike Lee, now that Jonathan Demme is late and lamented, could only spell disaster. And as I watched the film, there's so many strategies in the film that struck me as being trendy and woke, and it made me think that David Byrne is lost. He's not the big-hearted artist that I thought I discovered back in the late 70s and early 80s. Despite all his multiculturalism, despite his racially and sexually diverse players in American Utopia, none of that matters if the overriding vision is the same as an ugly Spike Lee condemnation of America. And the word utopia being a kind of a joke, like the word specialness. Something has gone terribly wrong with Mr. Byrne. And I think it's appropriate to look at it or to respond to it in a political way, because what's gone wrong, I think, has a lot to do with class issues, and it's the class issue of an elite looking at the masses, and the perspective that Byrne presents in American Utopia, as in True Stories, is not, sorry, Susan Sontag, not a nice one. By the way, I have there's a wonderful Morrissey lyric where he says, uh, I'm tired of people being nice because my life has been ruined by people who are nice. And
that works.
Yes, it works. And David Byrne being nice is just a cover for patronizing, and I think condemnation. And it makes American Utopia as ugly as Spike Lee's other films. Spike Lee might as well sign it because he signed on, so he might as well sign his name to it.
Well, you know, we start off the very beginning of the movie when the titles come up. Utopia is backwards. You know, as you're kind of saying, it's almost like a out of the gate irony. The idea that you can't achieve utopia within America because, you know, everything's corrupt and terrible, which I definitely understood. I understood that perspective when I was younger. And they say, you know, when you're, was it, if you're conservative when you're young, you have no soul. If you're liberal when you're older, you have no brain. I'm not going to go that far, but there is, this film is sort of the embodiment of that idea. David Byrne, I think if he wanted to be as progressive as he claimed to be, David Byrne's American Utopia would be more along the lines of David Byrne presents American Utopia, and you would never see him on stage. Get, you know, if he's interested in diversity and multiculturalism, get a Black or an Asian or Hispanic performer who can sing the Talking Heads hits the way that he can, or, you know, bring the next rising star up onto the stage and have a completely diverse cast. Watching him parade around talking about the ills of the world and how, you know, everyone needs to be more empathetic and everything's kind of corrupt and messed up and why don't more people vote. All I kept, and he's surrounded by, as we've mentioned, this diverse cast. That phrase white savior just kept popping into my head. I'm like, this looks awful.
Yes, it looks awful. And then I take your point about finding a talented surrogate for himself. But I thought the film hit rock bottom when he did a cover of a Janelle Monáe song, and it was Janelle Monáe's her Black Lives Matter anthem, and it's like, David Byrne, you got a huge catalog, and the worst song in your catalog is better than the best song that Janelle Monáe ever came up with. Why are you going there? Why are you succumbing to her Black Lives Matter propaganda when you haven't thought it through? And and also, as he introduces that song, he guilts himself. He admits his white guilt.
Yes.
As if this gave him permission to sing a very politicized song without understanding the politics behind it. And it destroyed the movie for me. At that point, the movie itself became stupid white liberal propaganda, and emphasis on the stupid, frankly, because he hasn't thought through the kind of revolution that Janelle Monáe is proposing. He's just singing it out of a kind of offensive condescension to Black experience, and for all the racial sympathy that's been apparent in Talking Heads' work, especially during the period of their world music period in the album Remain in Light. Nothing there was ever as offensive or as small-minded as in American Utopia. And so I think what's happened to David Byrne forces us to understand a kind of a political change that has taken place in popular culture, and it's unavoidable and undeniable when you see a film like American Utopia. His attitude towards America has worsened since True Stories. Perhaps when he made True Stories, well, I would say that his attitude towards America has curdled since True Stories. And there are many very political reasons for that we don't necessarily have to get into. I'm not averse to it. But that's what happened. And, and this is the it's a it's a it's a millennial phenomenon that so many of the pop artists that one used to have respect for have recently proven themselves embarrassing in terms of their political statements. And American Utopia, I think, is more a political statement than it is an artistic event. And that I mean, I'm as political minded as I often am. I think that might be the ultimate offense or the ultimate failing of it, that it's more political than it is enjoyable as music and theater, because everything in it is trying to sway you to think just like David Byrne does.
Yeah, which is to say, not to think very much at all. I mean,
and not to think very much at all, but also to think the way he does about race, the way he does about gender, the way he does about politics, the way he does about history. I know it's David Byrne's American Utopia. This is his expression, but he's also making theater. And he's also making theater under the pretense of entertaining an audience, and also under the pretense of welcoming American diversity. But as we've recently discovered, when progressives talk about inclusion, they they don't mean ideological inclusion, and all of that becomes apparent in America. Sad.
Yeah, I mean, talking about, I don't know what, honestly, from this movie, I don't know what David Byrne thinks about anything. I know that he's very good at making entertainment that appeals to people who are very much into slogans and slogan driven activism. But in terms of the nuance, that the Janelle Monáe sequence, that kind of made my stomach sink a bit too, or my heart rather. You've got the very obvious, it comes down, it ends with essentially the t-shirt image of all the Black people who've been, killed in these police related crimes. I mean, I've literally seen that t-shirt, but you've got you have pictures of Freddie Gray and Trayvon Martin and, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd coming up on the screen, as if to say, this is a monolithic problem. There's no nuance. It's just these people were killed by the police, and isn't that terrible? It is terrible. Any loss of life is, not something to be, celebrated, but it's also not something to be blanketed in the, talked about in one way. If you look up, a lot of these folks, there are questions, there are problems, there are investigations. Who is at fault? Was it the police officer? Was the victim doing something that, dumb that got them killed? Again, I'm not trying to paint everybody with a broad brush and say that, all the cops were innocent or anything, certainly not. But to put this all up and say this is endemic of a national crisis, and there's one of my least favorite phrases, open season on Black people, as if it's 1953, it seems really dishonest and, kind of gross.
Yeah, I thought I thought David Byrne was smarter than that.
Yeah,
Smart guy that he is. I thought he was smarter than that, but he's hey, I'll say it. He's apparently has Trump derangement syndrome, and he's fallen for all the other woke platitudes, and this is unfortunate for him. An artist who's done such good work in the past, such complex work in the past. He lost it. But I mean, it's easy to cite the TDS in American Utopia. But I think also if we go back to True Stories, you see the beginnings of those of wokeism, of progressive platitudes, and I say again, elitist condescension. The style of it just like that postmodern theatrical style of the mostly bare stage in American Utopia, bare yet spangly and stylish. Sometimes David Byrne's artiness doesn't work. It often does. Especially with the Talking Heads, his artiness most often works. But it was beginning to stop working in the mid '80s. And I say that as a Talking Heads enthusiast because I could feel the fall off after 1980, and particularly after his 1981 album called The Catherine Wheel, which was a kind of ironic look at the American family, the dissolution of the American family. But it's full of powerful music and really captivating and songs and music that make you think about your own part in the family unit and in society. And then I think his artistry began to fall off at that point. So when he got around to making True Stories, he wasn't in a good place creatively, I would say. And that's where I think he falls back on his art school elitism, the kind of thing that first came to present itself when he was a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, you know, kitty corner to Brown University, which. So I'll say specifically that part of Byrne's elitism is that kind of Ivy League detachment from others, from the rest of from working class and middle class America, and that began to come out in not likable ways in the mid '80s.
And that is something that I got from both True Life or True Stories and American Utopia. This idea that there's an entire section of America specifically that it doesn't feel like he's talked to or engaged with. I have a hard time feeling like he could go to a place like Virgil, Texas, and spend any kind of time there and hang out with people and then come out and make that kind of movie. I also find it weird. This is something that's only bothered me kind of in later years, is the idea of commercial artists making anti-commercial art. There's that big jag where Swoosie Kurtz is playing the woman, the wealthy, home bed-bound woman who's got like a robot servant and a voodoo doctor servant and the giant remote control for the TV, and all she does is watch TV and order things off the television. And then you get the Talking Heads video coming on, and it's this sort of making fun of commercialism. And yet, what are they doing? They're putting out, first of all, the band is selling records for a major record label, and they're also selling tickets to this movie that they're hoping people will come and see. So there's no nuance there. It's like consumerism bad, yet they're asking people to buy their products.
Yeah, consumerism bad, yet television bad, yet.
Yeah.
And as a former Talking Heads enthusiast, I also recommend to you their second album, More Songs About Buildings and Food. And first half of that album ends with a song called Found a Job. And Found a Job begins with David Byrne yelping, "Damn that television. What a fake picture." And the point of Found a Job is it's about a couple who turns off the television and videotapes themselves and makes their own art. And with making their own art, the song says they're happy now. Their lives are better because they're making their own art. This is a Rhode Island School of Design art school sentiment, I know, but it made a point. It made a strong point. How on earth did David Byrne, several years later, get to True Stories, where a woman is sitting in bed watching does not even watch television, and she's fed by her own personal robot? That kind of he hasn't created a character. He hasn't made her a character who learns to create her own art. He seems to have forgotten what I thought he had learned from going to Rhode Island School of Design, and he winds up just condescending to people who don't have the ability to make their own art. Uh, I don't know how he lost what he once used to know, but what he seems to be showing off in True Stories is a kind of elitist art student condescension. You mentioned correctly, I think, some of the imagery in Tim Burton that that is similar to the imagery in True Stories. But more specifically, the images in True Story are like certain kinds of art photographers, like this guy William Eggleston, and where things are looked at from a distance, where banal objects, banal and banal lives, banal people are looked at from a distance, as if under a microscope, under the scorching sun, as if this is and William Eggleston, like David Byrne in True Stories, they they say they're presenting American truths that most people ignore, but they're also at the same time making them more weird than they need. And I think that's political, that's elitist, and it's condescending. And it's a terrible way. I'll say it's a terrible way for an art student and a real popular artist who David Byrne is. It's a terrible way for them to wind up. I recommend more songs about buildings and food to you. It's a sensational album. It's a terrific album.
I'm definitely going to check it out. I mean, the title alone is fantastic. But it's a strange idea because, especially watching Byrne years later in American Utopia, he's an older man, and getting back to what I was talking about, age and conservatism, not necessarily conservative leaning, but at least an understanding that the world is not this idealistic, I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, but we're never going to get to utopia. Most people, what they do is they figure out something to do with their lives. They try and make a decent living. Maybe they settle down, try and have a family, whatever. It's possible to make something and be content, to be happy, and not necessarily living in a multi-million-dollar mansion or having everybody sing Kumbaya or whatever. It just feels like anything short of that is uncool or not worth striving for. There's a moment where he introduces a song, and I can't remember which one it was. I think I have it here. Pardon me while I look through my notes. It is, sorry, it's the one about the marching band. Everybody's coming to my house. That song. He says that his version of the song, and this kind of gets back to my idea of his autism, because it's about a bunch of people coming over to his house and he's like freaking out and wondering when they're going to go home. That sounds definitely like someone who's uncomfortable around people and perhaps has some kind of spatial issues, something that they would come up with. But he said that they were touring the show, and they performed it in Detroit, Michigan. They invited a local band to perform with them, student band, and their interpretation of the song forced him to reconsider the lyrics in a way that he'd never had before. The lyrics didn't change, the music didn't change, but there was a performance of it where they made it a welcoming song, not a fearful kind of paranoid song. And he tells that story. I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. But then he says, but I'm me. So we're just going to perform this version, my version of the song. And everyone kind of like laughs and claps and stuff. And when I hear it, I can feel the negativity and the nervousness coming off of David Byrne. But I honed in on the lyrics thinking, yeah, I could definitely hear this in an upbeat, cheerful, optimistic, kind of a way. And it just seemed to me, I understand not hiring a local school marching band to go on tour with you for Broadway, but perhaps for filming the music, the movie version of this Broadway show, maybe get the band in there, show them what you experienced, what touched you so much, versus just saying, they're not here, I'm just going to do it my way, and you'll all go home depressed.
Yep. And then there's also the idea of the implication in David Byrne's version is that white people don't know how to have a party or a picnic. White people they just don't know. Black people are having fun all the time. Everybody's going to my house. We're going to party, and white people just scared and fearful. It's awful, and that is to me that's the essence of elitism. It reminds me when Madonna made the Evita movie. I like the Evita score, by the way. When she made the Evita movie, and I think it was from the Evita movie, but she sings a song called "You Must Love Me," and I think it's supposed to be Eva Perón's egotism speaking, but it's Madonna speaking. You must love me because you must love me. I'm Madonna, and you must love worship by me. And a few years later, and I think a few years later, Jay-Z came out with an album with the Blueprint album, and I was so struck. There's a song where Jay-Z raps about his mother and the women in his life and how their affection surprises him. And he says, "You must love me." Like, he's amazed that somebody loves me. And it made me think of the difference between Jay-Z and Madonna. And this is not a racial difference. This is a difference about ego. And it's about ego. It's about one is being condescending or not. One is responding to other people's feelings, or you're locked in your own head, your own ego. From "you must love me" to "you must love me" to "everybody's coming to my house." Everybody's coming to my house. But David Byrne has lost the richness and complexity that he used to have. That's upsetting.
Well, it's something I don't think I'd heard that song before. But as I was listening to the lyrics, particularly there's that line, "I'm never going to be alone and they're never going to go back home." Mm-hmm. The way they end that song, it's like a close up of Byrne and his cast. And I think it was right around this time he had made a point of introducing everybody in the band by telling what country they're from and just kind of celebrating the diversity. And at the end of that song, they draw a lot of attention to "I'm never going to be alone and they're never going to go back home," making this sort of bizarre plea for immigration, for kind of an open borders policy. And that seemed like, is pretty on the nose. And it made me wonder, again, who's supposed to be watching this movie? It feels like a dig at like, see, all you conservatives out there who don't want, people from other countries coming to America, what do you think of that? And I imagine the reaction would be, we don't mind immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants. We just don't want a bunch of, undocumented people flooding into our country and, taking up resources. And yeah, I know that sounds harsh, but again, this seems to be this weird central, is this American/Western idea? You look everywhere else in the world, and they've got similar policies. Like, no, you come here if we want you to come here. This is not. There's no free lunch.
I think the implication that you pick up is correct. And if memory serves, "Everyone's Coming to My House" was actually recorded before 2016. What happened in 2016?
I don't know.
And TDS. And after Trump's election, I think Byrne's he emphasizes that song in a different way than the way he sang it before 2016. And it's not an improvement. It's a narrowing of meaning, and it's another piece of condescension. I think he is, again, singing to an elitist audience, or an audience that may talk diversity, but in their own lives, they really are segregated and superior and imperious and snide. And that comes through in his music now, and it used not to come through in his music. And it's what makes going back to true stories unpleasant, frankly. I should also say that, so when I watched it, and I watched the end credits closely, and I saw that there was a thank you in the end credits to a woman named Joan Tewksbury. And Joan Tewksbury is the screenwriter for Robert Altman's Nashville, which I consider the great American sound film. And Nashville is a rich and very complex depiction of the of the vastness of the United States, the spiritual vastness of the United States, I think it's condescending to national to say that it's multicultural or that it has diversity. It's got everything in it to me, and I suspected from that thank you to Joan Tewksbury that somehow David Byrne was inspired by Nashville, and in some ways was attempting a response to it or his own version of it, but he falls way short. And so what we're really talking about is how an elitist artist like David Byrne responds to the idea of America. And so I have to refer you back to More Songs About Buildings and Food, which when it came out in 1978, this was the post-punk, not post-punk, but this was the punk new wave, the punk music era, the beginning of the new wave. And people often refer to Talking Heads as a new wave band, but they're not. They're really an art rock band. They're an American art rock band. And an American art rock is kind of a cerebral elitist thing, but art rock was never politically narrow. And you never got the feeling from listening to art rock, and especially from listening to More Songs About Buildings and Food, that even when David Byrne wrote songs about hip alienation, that he was congratulating people for being alienated. And I think that's what comes through in American Utopia, that he's congratulating his white audience for feeling alienated, and also scolding and instructing them not to be, but still congratulating them for it at the same time. Well, in More Songs About Buildings and Food, which is art rock, he was responding to another great rock art band of the 1970s called Roxy Music. Do you know Roxy Music is?
I know of them, but I don't know their music.
You have so much pleasure awaiting you. Roxy Music had an album called Country Life. And Roxy Music is headed by a great artist named Bryan Ferry. And Bryan Ferry was in love with an American fashion model named Jerry Hall.
Yeah.
Who eventually married Mick Jagger. But in the mid 70s, he was dating and in love with Jerry Hall. Jerry Hall is a famous fashion model from Texas. Bryan Ferry is from England. And Bryan Ferry wrote a song for and about Jerry Hall called Prairie Rose. And the opening line is Texas, the location of True Stories. And he sings the word Texas with wonder. And the song has just an infectious and irresistible melody to it. And Bryan Ferry, Englishman Bryan Ferry, sings about the vastness of Texas, that it's a big country. Big meaning it embraces everything, but it's embracing him through Jerry Hall. Well, David Byrne took that song Prairie Rose. You could say he stole the melody. I prefer to say that he uses the melody as an homage to Bryan Ferry for his Talking Heads song called The Big Country. And The Big Country, you should hear it, you should know it, because it's a perfect example of David Byrne looking at America looking down at America as he's riding in an airplane. And he's observing everything from a distance. Everything seems smaller. Everything seems to have a pattern. And he says, I wouldn't live there if you paid me. And the melody's beautiful, but the sentiment at that point is not ugly, it's just ironic. And that worked in 1978. I think it works if you listen to the album today. But when that same kind of art rock gesture is made in American Utopia, it doesn't work, because the irony isn't balanced by great beauty. And the great beauty in Talking Heads is a Big Country, as in Roxy Music's Prairie Rose, is the expression of affection, of love, that comes through strongly in the music. So that no matter what the singer says verbally, cerebrally, his strongest emotion is of affection and love. And it's not working for Mr. Byrne anymore.
Yeah, it is completely detached. And it was towards the end of American Utopia. I think it was as he was going into the Janelle Monáe song, he does that self-flagellation thing that I can't stand, where he says, I need to do better. I'm like, I wish he would just pause and allow questions from the audience and have someone go up to him and say, what do you mean by that? Like, you, Mr. Philanthropist, Mr. Multicultural, your heart's in all the right places, you support the right causes. What is your great big sin? I have a feeling his answer would be, well, I'm white. But, it's just that whole thing of like, it's as if he wants to put that out there so that the people that he thinks are not doing better will be inspired to do better. But there's a bland hypocrisy there that just, it draws up bile in my mouth.
Yes, and really, how are we expected to respond to that attitude? I didn't pay $200 a ticket on Broadway, and therefore going to stand up and applaud it. Just as I watched it in American Utopia, and as I watch it in True Stories, my response is no, thank you. And there's a point I forgot to make. I talked over when I brought up Nashville. You know Nashville, don't you?
No. I feel terrible because like everything, I think the only thing I've recognized so far is Jerry Hall, and that's just because she was in Batman. But no, okay, Nashville is on my list of movies that I need to see because I need to see a lot of Altman's catalog, frankly. But hell, maybe we can talk Nashville at some point because you speak highly of it, and I've always wanted to see it.
It's a great opus, but he's got lots of great films, Altman has. But anyway, Nashville, it's about America, and so I think David Byrne was also responding or trying to make his own egghead version of Nashville. And so as I watched True Stories, I was appalled at the John Goodman song, but I picked up on some other lyrics than the ones you cited. I listened to those lyrics. We don't want love. I'm sorry. We don't want freedom. We don't want love. We don't want justice. We just want to be loved. And I thought this cannot pass as the way Texans think. It cannot pass as the way Americans think. For David Byrne to write those lyrics and put them in the mouths of strange, weird, average Americans is frankly insulting. And it's far, way far from the way Robert Altman ends Nashville, where a crowd of Americans gathered at a political rally / music concert and sing a song called "It Don't Worry Me." It's entirely different, Mr. Byrne. If anything, I mean, when you watch Nashville, it's very rich. I think it's Shakespearean rich, in fact. And there are multiple ways to look at every character, but it's never condescending to any character. And that song, "It Don't Worry Me," can be understood more than one way, and you will understand it more than one way when you see it, when you see the movie different times. But mainly, I think what comes through is the idea of resilience. And that's what Altman understands about America, about people, about time, about life. And David Byrne isn't capable of understanding that about America, it seems.
And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the whole autism thing. I am fine with giving him the benefit of the doubt, that maybe this is something that was diagnosed later in life. It could have been seen as, him being the aloof artist. It's cool to quote unquote not understand other people and, think of everything from this alien perspective. But if he really was dealing with that mentally, and expressed that sort of existential anguish through his art, I'm fine with that. But to watch that mode in 2020 or 2021, it is strange because I'm watching him on the stage and I can't quite figure out if it's an act or if it's genuine, because I could read it either way, if that makes any sense. There's a lack of authenticity there. I kind of want to give him a pass because, well, maybe he just doesn't know better, but then I feel like I'm condescending to him. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt of just being a grifter.
Sure. But part of the problem is he's rewarded for that now. He's rewarded for not thinking things through. And to me, that's a major issue with a lot of pop artists today. We don't all think alike politically, but before you make a public statement, you should think it through. And making a concert, making a Broadway show, making a movie is a public statement, and you really need to think it through before you do it, before you present it, rather, and certainly before you start preaching.
Yeah. Well,
what you're saying.
Well, I am glad that we talked through these two movies. Again, I can't look at True Stories the same way that I did a few years back. But I don't know if I ever would have cared for American Utopia. It just seems bogus from frame one to the end. But yeah, I'm glad that we talked about this. I'm glad you gave me a bunch more recommendations of movies to watch, and also that second Talking Heads album. Yeah. So do you have anything that you want to close out with? Any final words?
Well, I have your to-do list. That's all, which is Nashville, more songs about buildings and food, and Roxy Music. You'll be a happy person, a happier person to do. But really, also okay. So also the idea about America. One more thing on American Utopia. We don't. You never achieve utopia. You just you aim for it. You aim to see people with affection, with generosity. You aim for that. You aim to move in society in a way that's not selfish and hopeful. It's not an irony. It's not. The idea of utopia is not to be said ironically. It should perhaps be said as a goal.
Perhaps. I mean, I agree with you in the sentiment that it'd be nice to live in a world where everybody got along, but there seems to be this idea of utopia in that there'd be a world without struggle, where people don't have to work and suffer and strive. My own version of that utopia is a world where people do have to work and suffer and strive, because that's how people grow. Otherwise, we're just, on the earth for 90 years and just kind of emotionally and physically sedentary. And that sounds like a nightmare.
Well, don't get me wrong. I mean, I just think of utopia as the idea of living well together, and certainly living well together without scolding others. That's all. But gosh, we kind of get close to it when you experience a great work of art like Nashville, or Country Life by Roxy Music. So a little piece of utopia in there, perhaps.
All right. Well, I'm gonna check both of those out, and yeah, I might have to rope you into talking about Nashville, especially if I don't like it, because then we could have a really interesting conversation. No. As much as we've agreed on pretty much everything in this hour plus, I do think it's been fun on my end. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
I do, but I don't talk to people who don't like Nashville. I mean, if you don't like Nashville, there's something deeply wrong. It's like, I think an open-minded person, it's impossible for an open-minded person to see Nashville and be unmoved.
All right. Well, challenge accepted. But all right, man. Well, thank you again for talking to me. We'll talk again at some point soon. I really appreciate it, man.
I do too. I do too, Ian. Thanks a lot.
All right, take care.